Nationalism is not synonymous with xenophobia. In everyday speech, we usually call nationalism any hostility to ethnic others, which is not the meaning in which it is used in the Russian language at all. It is not used the way it is used in English, especially not in academic English. In academic English, this term does not have any evaluative component at all. It is rather close to the concept of patriotism in the Russian language. But, if there is a long trail of positive emotions behind patriotism, then there is no such thing behind nationalism. This is a purely non-evaluative scientific term that is used to describe identification with a nation, with a lot of people who belong to one of their own, united primarily by culture. The main discovery of the theory of nationalism of the 60s, 70s, and especially the 80s was that nationalism is a relatively new form of identity. Although any nationalism claims that the nation it represents has existed for centuries. In fact, diving a little deeper, we find that at some distance, it is impossible to find people who would seriously identify themselves with such a community, for example, with the French or with the British, or with the Russians even more. Before that, there are political associations. Before that, for example, the kingdom. There is some identity to the monarch and the family of monarchs among the feudal lords, rather than among those at the very bottom of this ladder. Because for those, it doesn't matter at all, in general, who to serve, and basically goes from one king to another. And they may not suspect about the peasants, on the territory of which kingdom they live. Most people don't even suspect. It is pointless to expect, for example, that there is some kind of French identity in France, if, in the time of Louis XIII, most people simply do not understand the language spoken in Paris. Prison, when he writes The Three Musketeers, clearly downplays the language difficulties, and the monstrous accent with which he had to speak d'Artagnan. But in general, the Gascons who come to Paris are these southern thugs from the mountain republics, who are partly kept because they can't conspire with anyone. They are relatively unintegrated, hungry, angry, and ready to deserve any service. And in this sense, to assume that they have some kind of identity with the inhabitants of Picardy, Bretons, Lotharins. Well, you just can't. They are as different as there can be different inhabitants of Europe, and therefore, no idea of Francuskoy, the fact that they are all French, they have obligations to France. And it's not the same as obligations to their king and the main employer, and not the same as in front of their family or some traditional Signer. There is almost no such idea then. It is believed that nationalism arises somewhere since the 15th century, the earliest in England, the 16th, 17th, but in full growth, and they assert themselves in the 18th century, when people discover that it is more important to be French, English, or Russian. This is their main political identity, and what determines their fate. Not that they are noble as a counterbalance to the ignoble, not that they are, say, Catholics as a counterbalance to a Protestant, not that they serve one monarch and not another monarch, but that they belong to some cultural community. Strictly speaking, there are no such cultural communities, because they appear, rather, following the development of mass education. Without a unified system of mass education with unified textbooks, it is very difficult to instill something in common. In people on a large territory, given the state of communications at that moment, they unwittingly speak different dialects in different countries, in different parts of the same of any large country. They live on different news. They are tied, rather, to their region, to the surroundings of some city, but not to a greater political education. National identity is the result of a long evolution of political and various other structures that are strongly associated with the modern state. Frederick II introduces the first system of universal primary education to every soldier in the army, understood the command of corporal. This is in fact the main incentive for starting to develop the Prussian welfare state, to restrain the discontent of the grassroots, to instill in them a certain degree of loyalty to their state, which did not exist before. There is no loyalty. And to force them to speak one language, and at the same time, in a different language than those which is spoken by potential opponents. Because Frederick II, he starts all these reforms for one reason. He tries to build armies entirely on fear of the corporal, but it turns out that the corporal, even if they are afraid, is not really understood if they do not understand his commands. And most importantly, Frederick II, despite the fact that he is a great commander, cannot supply his army with intelligence. Why? Yes, because as soon as the soldiers move away from the main part of his army by 200 paces, they run. They run anywhere, and it is necessary that they do not run. It is necessary that they relate themselves to this army in some way, feel that these are ours, and these are not ours. It is bad to run over to the enemy, and he is one of the first leaders who, at the state level, is trying to build a system of politics that would teach people to associate themselves with the state as the main source of their loyalty. But you have to pay for it with something. In response, the state declares itself the state of the people. A kingdom is not a state of the people. A kingdom is a political system that is given by the Lord to a monarch or a certain family of monarchs. The king, generally speaking, has no responsibility to his subjects. Catholics will argue about this for centuries, and some of them, who are rather on the side of the church, will leave the right to revolt the political rights of the church. But the question remains murky and somewhere on the borders of the then political consciousness. The idea that the king acts on behalf of the people, according to the will of the people, that any political power comes ultimately from the people, is of course a very new idea, and it comes at the same time when national identity arises, and partly, say theorists like Charles Stilley, in response to a purely military necessity. If you need a massive army soldier, you can't create it if you just intimidate them. They have to believe that this is their country. There is a big debate between whether nationalism is actually emerging in Europe for the first time. One of the main theorists of this entire intellectual movement, Benedict Anderson, argues that the first nationalism is American nationalism. The first state, which is declared the states of the people, arise not on the European continent, but in Latin America, and the North American colonies, which would later become the United States. They are the first to experiment with inclusive democracies. They are the first to announce that citizenship, for example, one of the colonies that fell off from the Spanish monarchy, applies to everyone who lives in this territory, including descendants of Indians, descendants of African slaves, and descendants of colonizers. A completely new idea for the 18th century. And only then does it penetrate into Europe, where the truth acquires cultural meanings familiar to us, because in Europe, this community can be built not only on a pure political contract, but also on the exploitation of the remaining cultural heritage. Many books have been written about how such things as national folklore actually arise, which arises in parallel with the language. Because after all, when the Brothers Grimm go to the German, we go to German cities and collect German fairy tales, they are looking for the origins of the German spirit. And it is known how many fairy tales they write themselves, and how many they do not collect. It is known that of the Kalevala songs, which are a traditional Finnish epic, and one of the main components of the Finnish cultural identity. Leonard wrote at least 3/4. Maybe he wrote more. This is a common story. This is more of a rule than an exception. Educated children go to these villages in order to collect folklore and study national history, while actually inventing it along the way. The main antithesis for nationalism at its core is the democratic movement. Now, today, we think of the nationalist rather as the extreme right and not the Democrats. Although there were nationalist movements in the 19th century, they were usually Republican. The French Revolution is at the same time an extremely nationalist movement, which for the first time speaks of loyalty to the Republic, loyalty to France, and not loyalty to the royal house as the main principle, and which at the same time is Republican. Garibaldi is a Republican nationalist. And Republicans are fighting monarchies, and there are excellent studies about the Romanovs, who are very ambivalent about Russian nationalism. On the one hand, it seems to be convenient, but on the other hand, the nationalists are one of their main rivals for them. Studies of nationalism have partly become a sign of the decline of nationalism itself, because very strong rivals have appeared for national identities. The first main rival of nationalism, the new rival of nationalism, were class identities and Marxist ideology, because Maxim says that national loyalty is a false consciousness that the bourgeoisie introduces in order to distract the working class from the struggle for universal happiness, and this is a very strong challenge. Most of the nationalist theorists I mentioned, they came from leftist circles, and they saw nationalist ideology as a significant competitor. The theory of nationalism flourishes the moment when these identities cease to be as important or as unquestionable as before. This is due to the rise of Marxism, and this is due to technological processes, everything that we call globalization, as a result of which these closed nations are an increasingly illusory reality. They simply disappear from our lives so much that it becomes extremely difficult to relate to them as the main source of authority. The state becomes too small to solve its problems and unwittingly unite first into political blocs, the Soviet bloc, the American bloc, and then many independent state ones appear on their ruins, and another large bloc of united Europe begins to pick up, and we see the construction of the bloc all over the world. In this world, national differences, rather, which were emphasized earlier for political and any other purposes, become, first of all, less and less real, less and less based on actual differences in culture. And on the other hand, everything is less in the interests of political agents. We see their erosion in Europe, at least. And it is very possible that Europe will again serve as a model at this moment.